They didn't steal your name all at once. They dismantled it slowly, piece by piece, until what used to carry your identity became something else entirely. It began with a single laugh, a joke told just loud enough to be heard, just quiet enough to deny. The way they shaped your name in their mouth, elongated it, sharpened it, turned it into something brittle. It didn't sound wrong, exact. It just didn't feel like yours anymore. Like watching someone wear your clothes and stretch them out until they no longer fit you. You stood there, heartbeat in your ears, waiting for someone to notice. No one did. What hurt wasn't the mocker, it was the performance. The synchronized betrayal wrapped in politeness. You caught the glance across the room before your name dropped like a knife on tile. You watched their shoulders lift just slightly in unison, like it was rehearsed. It wasn't spontaneous. It was practiced, and they smiled as they said it. That's what buried itself deepest. The smile, the way joy bloomed from your erasure. They weren't trying to correct. They weren't confused. They were entertained. You tried to speak once. You thought clarity would fix it, that if you just explained, just asked, they'd understand. But they didn't hear your correction. They heard weakness. It only added another layer to the joke. Your defense became their material. From that point forward, every version of your name was distorted. It was no longer a title. It became a spell to summon laughter, a soundbite for sarcasm. And every time you walked into the room, you weren't greeted, you were summoned. And somewhere in that fog of days and half-slept nights, you began to retreat. Not physically, no, you were still there, but something inside you folded in, locked the door, threw the key into a place even you couldn't name. You still responded when they called, but it wasn't really you answering anymore. They had taken the shape of your name and turned it into a stage, and they expected you to dance on it. So you stopped dancing. You started listening instead, not to the words, to the tone, the rhythm, the moments when your name dropped and someone new looked uncomfortable but said nothing. You started tracking who laughed and who just watched, and you began to understand something no one ever taught you in words. Names can be killed without silence. They can be hollowed out, worn like masks, and buried in plain sight. But the one who truly owns it still feels every theft like a phantom limb. And so you smiled too, not out of joy, but calculation, because now you understood they didn't mock your name out of power. They did it to contain you, to tether something they feared. Your name was never the joke. It was the cage, but cages can rust, and one day the name they corrupted would become something they couldn't say without choking on it. They just didn't know it yet. You stopped speaking, not because you had nothing left to say, but because you realized no one was ever really listening. They only heard what fed their fantasy, a caricature stitched together from fragments of your discomfort. Every time you spoke, they twisted your words into rope and pulled you into their theater. So you went silent, but not empty, not hollow. You began storing everything, their smirks, their timing, the way they gathered like insects over your hesitation. You studied their mechanics like an ancient tactician watching enemies feast before the war drums. They thought they'd won, that your silence was surrender. They didn't know it was strategy. You learned to breathe beneath the noise, to blend into corners, to turn walls into mirrors. While they danced and mocked and rehearsed their cruelty like a ritual, you observed the silence you wielded was not passive. It was precise. It stripped away illusion. You started seeing the cracks, the subtle tremors in their voices when they needed an audience, the dependency, the desperation. What they took for confidence was camouflage. Without you to target, they fumbled, confused. Their power was never real. It was borrowed, and you stopped lending it. In silence, your mind grew sharper. Stillness became your blade. You traced patterns in their behavior like ancient constellations. Betrayal no longer surprised you. It arrived on schedule. You became the quiet thing they couldn't read, the stillness that made them twitch, because silence has weight, and yours had begun to press down on them. They laughed louder, trying to fill it, but your absence had volume. It haunted the spaces you once filled. It distorted their sense of control. You understood something they never would. Not all fire makes noise. Some burns beneath the skin, slowly, mercilessly. You weren't hiding, you were forging. Beneath your silence, a new architecture took shape. Thought became structure, emotion became code. You stopped reacting and started planning. While they were loud, you became exact. They wielded chaos. You became math. They built bonfires to draw attention. You became the cold star watching from above, calculating. And when they finally noticed, when the echo of your voice no longer lingered in the rooms they tainted, they began to wonder. They felt the shift, but by then it was too late. You were no longer the version of you they had permission to mock. You had stepped behind a curtain of your own making. You were no longer part of their stage. You had become the silence behind their lines, the presence that made their confidence unravel. You had learned something sacred, that when they take your voice you do not scream. You vanish. You become the silence that remembers everything. You began to study their smiles the way an archaeologist studies ruins, delicately, obsessively, knowing something sacred and horrifying was buried beneath each crack. You didn't react when they said your name with that crooked lilt, that sarcastic venom dipped in performance. Instead, you memorized how their lips curled, how their eyes danced, not with joy, but with the relief of not being you. You stopped feeling the sting and started seeing the pattern. And what a beautiful, grotesque pattern it was. They thought they were improvising cruelty, but they weren't. They were following a script, one written by generations of weak minds, hiding behind humor, using mockery as a smokescreen for fear. You realized their laughter wasn't strength, it was camouflage. You counted how often they used your name when you weren't there. You traced the architecture of their narratives, how they needed a villain to make themselves feel righteous, how you had become the empty shape they filled with their insecurities, and when they laughed, oh, how they needed others to laugh too. That was the tell. Real predators don't need an audience, but these weren't predators. They were scavengers, huddled around your story like vultures that mistook your stillness for death. And so you listened, not just with your ears, but with that part of your mind that never sleeps, the one that records without mercy. You built dossiers in silence, psychological profiles written in glances and tone shifts. They thought they were playing a game, but you had become the observer behind the glass, clinical, detached, no longer bleeding. You weren't in the arena anymore. You were the one watching, taking notes, mapping every move. Their cruelty had a rhythm, their manipulation had rules, and once you saw the rules, they stopped surprising you. You even started predicting them. You'd walk into a room and know which one would smirk first. You knew who would avoid eye contact and who would pretend not to hear your name. As if the syllables burned, it became surgical, and in that precision you found power. You didn't need revenge, you didn't need confrontation, you just needed the truth. Because once you know what someone is made of, what hides behind their eyes when they think no one sees, you never forget it, and they can feel it. They know when they're being seen. So you watched, and you waited, not for an apology, not for redemption. You waited for the moment they'd realize that the version of you they mocked was gone, and the one standing in your place, he was never going to laugh with them again. He was never going to explain himself again. You had become something they couldn't touch, couldn't read, couldn't mock without trembling a little. Because now when they smiled, it was never quite real. One night without ceremony or witness, you buried your name. No tombstone, no obituary, just you and the sound of your own breath standing in the cathedral of your mind. You didn't cry, you didn't plead, you simply looked at it. That arrangement of letters once given to you like a gift, and realized it was never truly yours. It had been contaminated, twisted, passed between mouths like a joke, a label, a leash. They didn't just use it, they played with it. They scraped it across concrete and laughed while you bled. So you held it in your hand, brittle and blood-stained, and made the decision if they could strip it of meaning, then so could you. You whispered it until the sound emptied, repeated it like a chant until it became noise, until it no longer reached. It disintegrated, syllable by syllable, until you felt nothing, no sting, no spark, just the silence of release. And in that silence, something moved. You felt it, the shift, as if a door creaked open behind your spine. Something older than your pain, something that had been waiting, watching, the part of you that had no name, only memory. It stepped forward, and for the first time you stepped back. What walked out of that moment wasn't you, not the version they mocked, not the soft outline shaped by others. It was something forged, not built by approval, or laughter, or attention, built by silence, by observation, by endurance. It didn't flinch, it didn't explain, it didn't wear the name they ruined. It wore nothing but presence. They wouldn't recognize this version of you, because they were never meant to. They had built a map for a person they thought you were, predictable, pliable, named. But this was off the map. This was the shadow of the self that survived every betrayal, remembered every smirk, and now moved without need for translation. You stopped needing to be understood, or forgiven, or found, because now when they say your name, it no longer reaches you. It bounces off the walls of an empty chamber. They're calling into the past, and the past doesn't answer. Now your name is a locked door, and behind it, silence. That kind of silence that listens, the kind that unnerves. They feel it when they think of you. That tension, that gap, that echo. They try to say it like they used to, but it catches in their throat, because it no longer belongs to the person they thought they hurt. It belongs to something else now, something they can't touch, something that watches, something reborn. You returned, but not as they remembered you. Gone was the person they toyed with, the one who flinched when called, who dimmed their own light to avoid being mocked by shadows. What stood before them now was something colder, cleaner, cut from a different cloth. You wore silence like a cloak, and their words like stains that could no longer penetrate. They spoke your name again, tentatively this time, testing if it still had power. It didn't land the same. It trembled off their tongues like a forgotten spell, one they feared might summon something they couldn't control. You had become a mirror, not the kind that flattered, but the kind forged in war, one that reflects without mercy. You didn't need to strike back. You simply let them see themselves in your eyes, and that was punishment enough. Every smirk they gave was returned, every fake laugh parroted with surgical precision. You fed them their own tactic, not out of pettiness, but to complete the circuit, to show them the exact voltage of the pain they once delivered so casual. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't have to. Their own echoes collapsed on them. In your presence, their armor cracked. You noticed the flicker in their eyes when you entered the room. Not fear of you, but fear of themselves being seen by you. They began to fumble, overcompensate, over-explain. Your silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a pressure system, calibrated to rupture hypocrisy. You walked differently now, not lighter, heavier, like someone who'd buried versions of themselves and carried the tombstones in their stride. They laughed less, then barely at all, then not at all when you were near. Not because you asked them to stop, but because the performance died when the audience no longer gave them applause. They saw you and felt something ancient, like justice wearing the face of their past mistakes. You were no longer a participant in their game. You were the scoreboard, the rule book, and the quiet breath of karma in the back of their necks. In private, they began to say your name with care, In public they avoided it altogether. You became that which cannot be named, not out of erasure, but out of reverence tainted with guilt. You had entered their heads without force. You took no revenge, but your evolution rewrote the script they thought they controlled. You made them witness the ruins they left behind, and then made them live in it. They called it fear, but it was recognition, a reckoning they couldn't laugh their way out of. You became their unfinished sentence, their stuttered pause, their sudden silence in crowded rooms, not because you asked to be, but because once they looked into the mirror, they couldn't unsee what they had done. They thought it ended when you went quiet, that your silence was a white flag, that your absence meant defeat. But while they laughed in rooms you once stood in, you were building something deeper than revenge. You were documenting the anatomy of their betrayal, not to expose it. No, that would have been too merciful, but to hold it still, like a specimen under glass. You catalogued the exact pitch of their mockery, the timing of their betrayal, the digital trails they didn't think you noticed, every cruel message, every crooked smile, every time they uttered your name like it belonged to them. You saved it, not because you needed proof, because you knew one day they'd deny it. And when that day came, you wouldn't raise your voice. You'd raise the file, the screenshot, the voice memo, the timestamp. You'd simply open the vault you've kept buried behind your quiet eyes and let their own shadows drag them under. That's the difference now. You don't scream, you archive. You don't react, you remember. Pain once made you bleed, now it makes you sharpen. They forgot you were listening, observing, calculating. Harry. They forgot that the quiet ones are the ones who see everything. And when you stopped playing their game, you didn't walk away, you stepped outside the board entirely. You created a realm where you are no longer subject to their rules. You became the historian of their cruelty, the keeper of the hidden chronicle. And no one escapes the history they wrote in your present. It became ritual. You began to see it with sacred clarity, the pattern of betrayal passed down like cursed heirloom, the way they moved in predictable circles, always cloaking malice in smiles, always needing a name to sacrifice. You became fluent in their strategy. You stopped being their victim and became their archivist, their unspeaking jury. There was power in restraint, power in precision. They mistook your silence for absence, not realizing silence is the first language of storms. And now you carry it all. A library bound in digital chains and whispered memories. They don't know what you have. They don't know what you kept. That's the terrifying part for them. What's stored, what's sealed, what could emerge. You never threaten. You don't need to. Your existence is the pressure, the possibility, the question that lives in the back of their throat when your name is mentioned in a room that suddenly forgets how to breathe. Because when you become the archive, you don't have to haunt them, they haunt themselves. It started subtly. No fireworks, no declaration, just a hesitation, a delay between your name and their reaction. Someone blinked a second too long, someone else coughed into silence. It was the kind of shift only those who've lived in shadows notice. The jokes they used to make, those cheap, brittle echoes of your name stopped landing. Their laughter thinned, stretched into an uncomfortable grin, then disappeared altogether. Something had entered the room with them, a presence they couldn't explain but could feel tightening their lungs. You weren't there, but the air changed like you were. Their inner circle, once smug and synchronized, began fracturing in invisible places. Conversations no longer flowed with the same venom. Someone began asking, did we go too far? Not out loud, not directly, but in glances, in deflections, in the way their eyes lowered when the past was mentioned. They all remembered, even if they pretended not to. Every distortion of your name, every moment they turned you into a ghost before your time. And now the ghost speaks back, not with words but with presence, a kind of psychological static that follows them into rooms they used to own. You became the phantom limb of their memory, a part they once cut off with laughter, now aching in silence. They tried to rewrite history, bury it in inside jokes and groupthink, but your silence made space for the truth to fester, and fester it did. Doubt became contagion. They couldn't stop themselves from revisiting what they did, not because they missed you. No sentiment had long rotted, but because they feared the version of you they had summoned. You weren't the same. You had evolved in exile, far from their stage, behind doors they could no longer open. What they mocked had grown teeth. Some of them tried to reach out, not with apologies but with offering, breadcrumbs, half-hearted check-in. They wanted reassurance that you were still who they remembered, still small, still uncertain, still asking to be let back in. But you didn't answer. You didn't need to. Your silence was calibrated, precision engineered. It was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a judge. And so the echo chamber imploded, not with volume but with vacuum. You were no longer a subject of their conversation. You were the void circling them, reminding them of what they'd unleashed. Even the boldest among them, the architects of your humiliation, flinched when your name surfaced. It came out crooked now, hesitant, as if uttering it would awaken something they couldn't control. And perhaps it would. You had become an ancient warning whispered beneath breath, a name etched not in stone, but in nervous glances and broken alliances. They couldn't agree on who you were anymore. They only knew what you weren't: silent, forgotten, or weak. Their world, once airtight and cruel, now pulsed with tension. A crack had formed in their reality, and through it your legend was breathing. There was a time your name filled rooms before you did, a time when it cracked through the silence like breaking glass, mispronounced, mocked, thrown around like it didn't belong to anyone real. They said it with laughter, with sharp tongues and soft lies. They made it a costume, a target, a punchline. You heard it echo in rooms where you weren't welcome, bouncing off walls like a curse stitched into the air. And yet, you kept breathing, you kept watching, you kept becoming. Now it's different. Now your name doesn't belong to them anymore. It has become something heavier, something ritualistic. They hesitate before speaking it, like a word dug out of a buried language, half remembered and half feared. What once came so easily now catches in their throats. It no longer rolls off their tongues. It clings to them, a ghost clinging to its final breath. They avoid it, replace it, skip it in conversations like a broken step on a staircase, as if saying it might bring something back, or worse, wake something that never left. Because you never needed revenge. You never screamed. You never begged for your name back. You let it burn. You let it die in their mouth. And in that silence, it transformed. You became something else. Something without a label, without a leash. You walked through their ridicule like smoke through a battle, untouchable, unreadable. And while they built narrative, you built silence. While they traded jokes, you traded truth. You let them choke on their own echo. Your name lives now in the space between things, in the pause before they speak, in the stiffness of their posture when someone mentions the past, in the quiet glances exchanged when someone asks where you went. It exists not as a memory, but as a warning, a locked door, a redacted file, a symbol carved into stone, wrapped in caution, humming beneath the floorboards of their conscience. They remember what they did, not in words but in weight, and somewhere in their minds they wonder what you did with the silence they gave you. They wonder if you still hear them, if you still watch, if the myth they created came back with a spine and a crown. But they'll never ask. They won't dare, because some things once broken don't return. They evolve, they crystallize, and your name has become a mirror. A mirror they can't look into for too long without seeing themselves. So now they don't say it, not because they forgot it, but because they remember too much. Because that name, your name, no longer fits in their mouth. It's too sharp, too real, too dangerous. Some words are not lost, they're sealed. Some names aren't erased, they're retired. And when they whisper around it, when they stutter and stole and redirect, you'll know. You were never erased. You became sacred.